Hello there. Welcome to Poly Talks, and in this episode, we'll be covering how 2020 election deniers fared in 2022 midterm races. And just to clarify, this election is by no means over. We have seen in many states that Republicans have underperformed, and in fact, Democrats have retained control of the U.S. Senate. I believe when I made my video last, we did not know this yet. However, this is a reality because Arizona was called a few days ago and Nevada was called just yesterday. So, we know that the Democrats would retain control of the U.S. Senate through this race. Cortez Masto, the incumbent senator in Nevada, wins narrowly over Adam Laxalt, which is a very poor result for the Republicans who are hoping to pick off Nevada, potentially Arizona, potentially Pennsylvania, Georgia, New Hampshire, etc. And while Georgia is going to runoff and we do not yet know the results, Warnock is still favored to win that runoff on December 6th. So what we are seeing is an underperformance of GOP expectations. On the House map, we have also seen an underperformance of GOP expectations, even as it is looking like the Republican Party will retain or win control of the United States House. And that actually, it's not yet a given considering the number of uncalled races, but it's looking more and more likely. However, this is still an underperformance for Republicans. You look at Kevin McCarthy's statements. I believe early in the cycle he said Democrats could lose up to 60 seats, and now that's looking like 60 over 10, a lot more than 60. So what we're seeing is a drastic underperformance of GOP expectations. They did have some successes, such as in New York. If you look here, most of these races, very competitive. They flipped them, some of them by large margins. You can see this one. These were really poor results for Democrats. Sean Patrick Maloney, who's actually the DCCC chair, while he had an otherwise good election night, he ended up losing his own seat for the first time in 30 years. So that is a very poor result. You can just see some of these practically all competitive House seats went to Republicans. Look, this one was marked as competitive, and the Republicans won in a landslide. I mean, there are some votes left to count, but what we can see here is that while Republicans did have some successes, there were actually many other Democratic successes, and one of those is in Washington's 3rd District, which actually relates to the subject of the video today, because Republicans were given a 98% chance of winning the seat. 98% chance. Solid R. This race went to Democrats. This is yet another example of one of the many races across the country in which the GOP underperformed expectations to a large extent. And what we're seeing is a very poor result for Republicans, even as they might retain control of the House. But part of the reason this race went to Democrats was because the incumbent here was a Trumpist and an election denier. And this incumbent actually primaried the incumbent who voted to impeach Trump, Jaime Herrera Butler, and had she been nominated instead, I'm confident she would have won this race, but count was too extreme for this district, and it ended up deciding to elect a Democrat to the House, which is a shocking result. And Colorado's 3rd District, while it is looking like we will see a Boebert win here, this should not have been even remotely close. Going back to the forecast, look what handicappers gave this Democrat in terms of their chance for winning. 3%. 3%. So actually, this is a more unlikely race, or a more likely race to go Democratic than Washington's 3rd, but they're still around the same percentage, and they should not have gone to Democrats. This is, frankly, more of an upset than Kendra Horn's win in 2018 in Oklahoma. I am shocked that these two Democrats came even close to winning, and one of them is looking like has projected to win. And the reason why is because this country and many of the districts within it simply cannot stand for election denialism and Trump attributes as we've seen in this election, and we've seen this before. We've seen this in the Georgia runoffs in 2021. We've seen this in 2020 when, even though Republicans had a better than expected down ballot performance, they still lost the presidency. I'm not saying this election was a complete and utter rebuke of Republicans as a whole, but it certainly was a rebuke of the more extreme Trump end of the party. And it's shown that while these Trump endorsements can propel candidates to a primary victory, the same cannot always be said for a general election victory. And so looking at this map here and the fact that Republicans were expected to win, I believe, 230 seats, and 204 have already been called for Democrats, and a couple more will certainly go in their favor, I think. So this was an under expectation for Democrats, and they've had so many different under expectations and polling errors, and the reason being election deniers. And these more extreme candidates have, by and large, failed where it really matters. Now, it would be foolish to just look at these races and say, oh, Greg Abbott won in Texas. And if you look on this page here, you can see Greg Abbott is purportedly a election denier as per CNN. However, he ended up winning his race, but this is Texas after all in a supposedly Republican favorable year. And I think that it was basically impossible for the get-go for Republicans to win this, for Democrats to win this race. So that's not much of a surprise. And keep in mind, it's only 11 points in what should have been a much larger victory. But what we're seeing here, by and large, is election deniers losing their races. 4 secretaries of state won their races in 2022. Let's look at these states. Alabama, deep red. Wyoming, deep red. South Dakota, deep red. Indiana, deep red. And all of these other races some of them are in very competitive states. Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, even to an extent New Mexico and Minnesota. And now governor, let's take a look here. Now, most of these are in solid Republican states, with the exception being Joe Lombardo's win in Nevada. Now, this was something of a disappointment for Democrats. While they did end up winning the Senate race here, you can see they lost the governor's race by a decent margin. And I think this can be attributed to not so much Joe Lombardo's great candidacy, but Sisolak's actions on the economy and kind of the downfall of the casino industry in Nevada over the past few years, which really harmed Sisolak. And if you take a look, you can see that voters tend to blame the incumbent governor more so than the incumbent senator for statewide troubles and tribulation. So we can see here that Nevada may have gone Republican purely based on the Democrats' inability to win here instead of the Republicans' great candidacy. But that is the one competitive state here. Texas, Florida, not really competitive this cycle. Arkansas, Alabama, Idaho, South Dakota, Iowa, Alaska, these are all, for the most part, very Republican states. And all of these other states here, we have had results in Michigan, Minnesota, Arizona, and I want to talk about this right now, because just recently, Katie Hobbs was projected to defeat Kari Lake in the state of Arizona. This should not have gone to Katie Hobbs. She was kind of a lackluster candidate. She did not show up for debate. She ran a largely underground campaign. She was nothing exciting in the state, and most people, including 538, if I can find the forecast here, expected Kari Lake to pull this off. 68% chance of a Kari Lake victory. Guess what? Katie Hobbs won. And you want to know why? Because Kari Lake was an election denier. And I'm not saying this is the sole issue and sole reason why Republicans lost, but this far-right extremism, election denialism, is really not sitting well with American voters. And I think what the Republican Party needs to realize is that this is not a fluke. This is a sign of a greater rebuke against election denialism and far-right extremism in this country, and Republicans need to diverge from that path if they want to win competitive races. Pennsylvania, landslide victory for Josh Shapiro. Tim Michaels, look at his percentage chance of winning. This was a toss-up race. He was expected to nearly win. Most forecasts gave him a slight edge, and he ended up losing to incumbent governor Tony Evers, which was a huge disappointment in Wisconsin because Tony Evers is the sole obstacle to Republican-passed state legislature bills, and he ended up winning by 3.5% in a race he was expected to lose. So clearly we can see a rebuke against these far-right extremists, and we've seen in Pennsylvania, other states, this simply is not a strategy that Republicans can repeat over and over again. It is not sustainable. We've seen time and time again that this doesn't work, and we can go on to the Senate as well, although this one is a little more evenly split. But again, most of these red states, with the exception of North Carolina, we have Alabama, Louisiana. Now, Wisconsin's quite an odd one. I think compared to the other results of the cycle, I was a little surprised this one went to Republicans, although it is important to recognize the Democrat really began to falter in the later stages of the campaign here. And by the end, he was, if I can find the Senate forecast, I believe he was quite heavily favored to lose. Yeah, so 81% chance. So I think this may have been due to the Democrats' failure and to run an effective campaign, and they really should have unseated Ron Johnson. They should not have invested money in Florida, although that has happened, that has passed. So moving forward, we can see in the Senate, again, deep red states, Oklahoma, Utah, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Missouri, and Ohio, which was somewhat competitive this cycle, but again, ultimately it is a red-leaning state. Herschel Walker, that remains to be decided, but like I said, Warnock is favored. Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, that's a big one. Adam Laxalt is another big one. He was expected to win by most people. Blake Masters, Mehmet Oz. We are just seeing a slew of candidates that failed due to their embracement of these election denialism. So moving forward, the key takeaways for Republicans this election is this is not a viable strategy. Trump may be a great mechanism for winning in primaries, but it doesn't matter if you win in primaries if you can't win a general election. And we saw even in states like Arizona, Blake Masters, endorsed by Trump, won his primary, and guess what? He shifted his views to the center because at that point he had already won the primary nomination. And I think if this was just endorse Trump, go hard to the right, and then once you win your primary, you shift to the center, if that was a viable strategy, then I think Blake Masters would have won. Although he did not. He lost by quite a significant margin. This is the governor's map. But yes, he lost by quite a significant margin, and the reason simply being that he was still viewed as too far to the right because of his past statements and records. Shifting to the center after winning the primary for the last few months or weeks of the election is simply not a viable strategy. Republican candidates from the get-go need to be completely disavowing these rumors of election denialism, and otherwise they will lose general elections in many of these competitive states. So what we are really seeing here is a rebuke of election denialism and a clear message to the GOP that while Trump's endorsement may be great for the primaries, it is simply a losing strategy in the general elections. So that concludes today's episode, and I hope that I can make a video soon, either analyzing the final results of the midterms after we've seen all the results, although I likely do not think with the outstanding ballot totals in California and such that we will know House control for weeks. So I might postpone that video, and soon I will make a video discussing the effects of, the impacts on climate change and environmentalism of the 2022 midterm. So stay tuned for that. See y'all. Bye.